Hi, everybody. I'm showing it's 9:30, so perhaps we should get started. Welcome to the June 14th Independent Taxpayer Oversight Committee meeting. I'd like to thank all the staff for their efforts to pull the meeting together, and a thank you to everybody on the phone and the web for taking the time to join us today. Today's meeting is virtual, and our iTalk members are participating in the meeting remotely. We'll take live public comments. Please raise your virtual hands at the appropriate time if you have a comment. I'll now ask our clerk to confirm that we have a quorum. Clerk?
We do have a quorum.
Great, thank you, clerk. Before we proceed further, I'd like to ask our interpreter, Ruth Monroy, to walk through how to access our interpretation services for today's meeting. Ruth, please proceed.
Thank you. I will repeat the announcement in English. Para hacer uso del servicio de interpretación, por favor desplácese a la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom donde aparecen los controles. Haga clic en el icono de interpretación, que es el globo terráqueo, y seleccione su idioma. Si está utilizando la aplicación móvil de Zoom en celular o tableta, presione los puntos suspensivos, luego Interpretation y luego el idioma. To use the Zoom interpretation feature, please scroll to the bottom of the Zoom screen where the meeting controls are located. Click on the interpretation icon, which is the world, and select your language. If you are using the Zoom mobile app on a cell phone or tablet, please press the ellipses, then interpretation, and then choose the language. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. I'll now ask our committee liaison to provide a quick reminder on how the public and member comments will work, please. Sarah?
Thank you, Vice Chair Halpern. I will go over these reminders today. The members will be using their cameras and we will take live public comments. Members are asked to turn on their cameras when they have a comment or question, and then Vice Chair Halpern will recognize you. As noted on the cover page of today's meeting agenda, in addition to emailing comments, the public may also provide live comments during today's meeting. In order to provide live comments, you can join today's Zoom meeting through the link or by dialing one of the numbers from your phone that are provided on the cover page of today's meeting agenda. Join the meeting by clicking on the Join Webinar link provided in the confirmation email you receive upon registering. When public comments are called for on an item, on the Zoom platform, click on the raise hand icon in the Zoom toolbar on the top right of the screen. The chair will call you by the name you provided. If you are participating by telephone, press *9. The chair will call on you by the last 3 digits of your telephone number. The instructions for providing live comments are also on the bottom of the cover page of today's meeting agenda, which can be accessed from the homepage of SANDAG's webpage at www.sandag.org. All comments, whether emailed or live, will be made a part of today's meeting record. Thank you, Vice Chair Halpern.
Okay, great. Let's get started. The first item, number 1, is public comments and communications and member comments. Do I have any public comments on this item? Please raise your hand at this time.
I don't see any hands from the public.
Great, thank you, clerk. Do we have any member comments? I'm not seeing any. So at this point, we can move on to item number 2, which is the agency report. I believe Andre is going to be providing that today.
Yes, thank you, Vice Chair Halpern, and good morning, committee members. I want to start off by acknowledging an important unexpected loss to our SANDAG family. SANDAG financial analyst Julie Barajas passed away last month. For nearly 8 years, Julie was a tremendous contributor to our TransNet financial planning, budgets, and grants department. It is a huge loss to the agency, both professionally and personally. Over the years, Julie has become a friend to many, and she'll be sorely missed. We've also had several loved ones of our SANDAG staff pass away recently. It has been a tough couple of weeks for many. I'd like to ask we take a moment of silence for Julie and all of those that we have lost. Thank you. On Saturday, June 4th, Sandag and Caltrans celebrated the completion of several new transportation, highway, rail, and environmental projects as part of the North Coast Corridor with the community event and ribbon cutting. This was a special day for nearby residents who have endured construction noise and detours for many years, 5 years actually. During the long celebration, nearly 1,200 attendees explored the improvements on the pedestrian paths and bikeways. The event received overwhelming positive media coverage and praises from community members. This project is a great example of what we can accomplish when we work together. Last week, the Del Mar Bluff Stabilization Phase 5 project went to the California Coastal Commission to seek approval and a coastal consistency permit for construction. I'm happy to report the project was unanimously approved by the Coastal Commission. The Losan Corridor is a key component of our regional economy and national defense, and we're moving as quickly as possible to stabilize the bluffs until we can move the tracks inland. In other news from last week, we celebrated the groundbreaking of the Bayshore Bikeway, the Barrio Logan segment. This bikeway will connect two existing segments of that Bayshore Bikeway and extend 2.3 miles along Highway Harbor Drive between Park Boulevard and 32nd Street. This project was a long time coming, and we are also glad to be moving forward on it. I want to update you on the latest on Otay Mesa East. Not surprisingly, as we get closer to construction, costs are starting to come in higher than originally estimated. We've also received some initial feedback from the rating agencies, and in order for us to secure investment-grade ratings, we may need to create an additional reserve account. As a result, staff is working through some ideas to create a $20 million reserve account for the project and identify potential cost savings of about $2 million from other projects to cover the latest cost estimates on this project. We'll be going to the board next week to talk through these options. We also had the honor of hosting FDA Deputy Administrator Veronica Vanderpool and her staff last week for a tour of our priority projects, including the Del Mar Bluffs, the newly opened extension of the UC San Diego Blue Line, and the San Isidro Mobility Hub. This weekend, the southbound lanes of the SR 125 toll road will be closed from SR 54 to East H Street, so we can install new gantry tolling equipment. This includes closure of the SR 54 connectors to southbound SR 125. The updated equipment will enable new transponder models to be used on the roadway and ensure accuracy in toll transactions. These improvements are part of the broader effort we've talked to you about equipment upgrades along the SR 125 toll road and I-15 express lanes. The closure will take place from Friday, June 17th at 8 p.m. and reopen by Monday, June 20th at 6 a.m. Detour signs will be in place to minimize traffic impacts and guide motorists around the closure. And just as a note, Juneteenth falls on Sunday this month, and we'll be observing it on Monday, June 20th. This is the first time that Sandag is observing the holiday and the progress it presents for racial equality in our nation. That concludes my report, Vice Chair. I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you. Do we have any public comments on this item? Please
We don't have any hands up from the public.
Yep, okay. And do we have any member comments or questions? Anybody going once? I am not seeing any member hands. Am I missing anybody? Shout out if I am. Okay, then let's move on to item numbers 3, 4, and 5. This is the consent agenda. Before we take action on this, do we have any public comments on these items? Oh, I'm seeing Pedro. We'll get to you in a second. Do we have any public comments on these items? Okay, Pedro.
I would like to talk about item number 4. So maybe we want to pull it.
Sure. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Then before we get to item number 4, could we, or should we do a motion for approval of the minutes first? Can I get a governance check on process? Anybody?
So move.
Okay, all right. Well, we have a motion to approve the minutes. Do we have a second?
Mike Kenny, I'll second that.
Okay, we have a motion by Pedro, a second by Mike, to approve the minutes. All in favor, clerk, can we take the roll?
Thank you, Chair. For real estate right-of-way acquisition, Jonathan Frankel.
Frankel, yes.
For licensed civil traffic engineer, Michael Kenny.
Approve.
For contractor construction, Pedro Orso Delgado.
Yes.
For biology environmental, Dustin Fuller.
Yes.
For finance and budgeting, Vice Chair Halpern.
Halpern, yes.
And for licensed engineer, Les Hopper.
Yes.
Thank you. And CEO private sector is absent. And with that, that item passes unanimously with those members present.
Great, thank you. Okay, so then item number 4, which is the draft schedule of ITALK meeting agenda topics. Pedro, did you have some comments or questions?
Primarily a question. One of the projects that I recently kept seeing a lot of highlights on is the Central Mobility Hub. And I don't know if we at ITALK are going to be receiving a presentation. I know that probably at this point in time, the project doesn't have a lot of TransNet funds, but it would be of my interest to see that being presented here at ITALK.
Gotcha. Ariana, is that something that you would speak to in terms of what the expectations are, or somebody else from staff?
Yeah, absolutely. We can bring something back to you. No problem. We'll work with staff.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other member questions or comments on that item? Or Pedro, anything else?
No, sir. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so items 4 and 5 are just informational, so we don't need to take any action, in which case we can move on to item number 6, which is actions by a transportation committee and board of directors on TransNet related agenda items. And Ariana, you're going to present this.
I am, and I just have a few updates since your last meeting, which was in May. The board approved the TransNet Smart Growth Incentive Program funding recommendations, and you reviewed those back in April. Then in May, the board approved the final FY23 program budget, and that included your operating budget that you recommended at your meeting in February. And then finally, last week, the TransNet ITALK Selection Committee reappointed ITALK member Mike Kenny for a 4-year term through May 2026. So congratulations to Mr. Kenny.
That's it?
That's it.
Okay. All right. Do we have any public member comments on this item? Raise your hand now. I'm not seeing any so far. No? Okay. Do we have any committee member comments or questions for Ariana on this item? I see Michael Kenny.
Glad to be reappointed. Thank you for your efforts on my behalf. That was, I know we had some discussion about the appointment process in the past, and couldn't have been smoother. No discussion for reappointments. So, thank you.
Well, on behalf of everybody on the committee, Mike, thanks for stepping up and doing it again. We appreciate you. Any other member comments or questions on this item? Not seeing any hands. Okay, then we can move on to item number 7, which is the final or fiscal 2022 ITALK annual report. And I believe Zara, you're going to be presenting this item.
Yes, good morning, ITALK members. We are here today to present to you the final FY 2022 ITALK annual report. I would like to thank the committee for all of its thoughtful comments, and a special thank you to our annual report subcommittee, Chair House, Mr. Pedro Orso Delgado, and Mr. Les Hopper. Based on feedback from the subcommittee since the January ITALK meeting, the format of the draft annual report continued focusing on the role of the ITALK and the result of both performance and fiscal audits. The TransNet funding and project progress highlights were also addressed in the report. At our May meeting, ITALK members reviewed the draft 2022 ITALK annual report and requested that members' compliance with meeting attendance requirements be included in the final report. This information has been included on page 1 of the report, and there has been no additional feedback provided by the subcommittee and the ITALK after that. Today, we are asking this committee to provide your approval of the final report. If approved, Chair House and staff will present a report to the Board of Directors at their July meeting. That concludes our presentation. We'll be happy to answer any questions that the committee may have. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Before we go to committee members, do we have any public comments on this item? I'm not seeing any hands yet. Maybe give it a moment. No, okay. Can we have a motion from the committee to approve this item?
I'd move to approve it, Stuart.
Thank you, Les. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Happy to second that motion.
Thank you, Jonathan. We've got a motion by Les, second by Jonathan. Do we have any discussion or questions from the committee members before we move to a vote? Anyone? No, okay. I'll just say that, I've been on this committee for a while. I think this really is the best annual report I've seen in my tenure here. So I just wanted to say congrats to everybody. We appreciate all the efforts. But with that, then, Clerk, can we move to a vote?
Thank you, Vice Chair. For real estate right-of-way acquisition, Jonathan Frankel.
Frankel, yes.
Board licensed civil traffic engineer, Michael Kenny.
Yes.
For contractor construction, Pedro Orso Delgado.
Yes.
For biology environmental, Dustin Fuller.
Yes.
For finance and budgeting, Vice Chair Halpern.
Halpern, yes.
For licensed engineer, Les Hopper.
Yes.
And CEO private sector is absent. And with that, that item passes unanimously with those members present.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now we are moving on to item 8, which is an acceptance of the fiscal 21 TransNet fiscal and compliance audits. And I believe Yen Ho and Marcus Pasquale are going to be presenting this item.
Yes, Vice Chair Halpern, I will be presenting this item.
Okay.
So good morning, Vice Chair Halpern and members of the ITALK. I'm Marcus Pasquale with the Finance Department. In today's item, we are presenting the final results of the fiscal year 2021 TransNet fiscal and compliance audits for your acceptance. Jennifer Farr, who is a partner at Davis Farr LLP, will summarize the stages and approvals that led up to this point and will also summarize the findings from the draft reports. Once Jennifer is done, I will go over the substantial changes between the draft and final reports, and we'll then ask the committee to accept the item after answering any questions. So I will now turn the presentation over to Jennifer.
Thank you, Marcus. So now that we are in the final stage of the process, I'd like to briefly walk you through the steps of what happened during the year and how we got to this point. Last June, the ITALK Audit Subcommittee was provided with the proposed procedures for review. And at the July ITALK meeting, those procedures were approved. The Davis Farr team then scheduled and performed the procedures for the 24 agencies from the period of October 2021 through January of 2022. The draft reports were presented to you on March 9th, along with the agencies that did not meet the requirements. On April 15th, the Regional Transportation Committee recommended approval to the SANDAG board for agencies that did not meet the requirements. And on April 22nd, SANDAG's Board of Directors approval was obtained. ITALK is now accepting the reports for release and issuance. As a reminder, we reported the following 4 findings in the draft reports. The first one is for the cities of El Cajon, Escondido, and Del Mar. They did not consistently use the approved exaction fee of $2,583 from each newly constructed residential housing unit. The agencies are in the process of collecting additional amounts from the developers. And also for the city of Lemon Grove, we have a finding that relates to the prior year finding in this area that has not yet been resolved. So that finding will carry forward until that issue is resolved. The second finding is related to the maintenance of effort requirement. We reported to you that the cities of Del Mar and San Marcos were not in compliance with the maintenance of effort requirement for the fiscal year ended June 30, 2021. And both agencies are planning to make up the shortfall in spending in the fiscal year ended June 30, 2022. The third recommendation was for the city of Coronado to improve documentation of staff time charged to TransNet projects. And the city is planning to make improvements to their documentation along with implementation of a new ERP system that will help them with that process. And the last finding was related to rail operator eligibility for NCTD. After NCTD requested approval for the exclusion of cost, the rail operator eligibility requirements were met. I will now turn it back over to Marcus for the recommendation.
Thank you, Jennifer. So before we go over the recommendation, I just want to go over the substantial changes between the draft and final reports. These changes were as a result of board approval of eligibility requests. So those changes were NCTD findings have been removed and the rail services calculations have been updated to adjust for certain cost exclusions. The city of San Marcos finding response has been modified to include board approval to make up the MOE deficit by June 30, 2024. And the city of Del Mar finding response has been modified to include board approval to make up the MOE deficit by June 30, 2024. So with that, I will now present our recommendation. ITALC is asked to accept the final fiscal year 2021 TransNet fiscal and compliance audit reports prepared by the independent auditing firm Davis Farr LLP in accordance with the agreed upon procedures so that the final audit reports may be issued. And that will conclude the item.
Great. Thank you, Marcus and Jennifer. Before we move on to the committee members and taking up the recommendation, do we have any public comments on this item? I'm not seeing any hands right now, but I'll give you a second before we move on. Okay, I take it there are none. Do we have a motion to approve this item from the committee? I see Michael Kenny's hand raised. Thank you, Mike. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Sadly, I don't have a motion.
Oh.
I did have a question about the NCTD, I guess, component of the report. When is so the other issues seem to come and go with projects, specific issues, but this specific one seems to stick from year to year. When would we be hearing about this issue next if it was to persist for the next fiscal year? What meeting would we be hearing about this issue? And I guess that's more of a question for staff than it is for our auditor.
Ariana, do you want to?
Yeah, so this is one of the considerations that has been discussed when we brought those draft concepts for the ordinance amendments, right? Because this is a recurring issue. And not only the ITALC, but also the Transportation Committee has asked that we revisit this section of the ordinance to make it, to make the metric, more in line with what, just make it more consistent, I guess, with not only what is happening, but also with potentially with the TDA. So the Transportation Development Act, right? The TransNet ordinance is modeled somewhat after that, and the state is taking another look at the TDA. So we're paying a close eye to that, and then bringing this back so that we can propose some changes as necessary. So that is something that we plan to bring back to you at a future meeting.
And was that on our agenda from the previous item?
Which previous item are you referring to?
Well, we had the whole year's calendar in front of us.
Oh, yes, actually. So we are planning on coming back in the fall with a work plan to share with you about the ordinance amendments. So this fall, we plan to bring back a discussion on that.
All right, in a few months.
Mhm.
Thank you. That and it had the report read well. It just jarred my memory on that particular issue. So for that, I'll go ahead and make the motion to approve the report as submitted.
Thanks, Mike. Do we have a second? Jonathan, I presume that is that for a second?
I'll second the motion, Stuart. I do have a question.
Sure.
Now's the appropriate time.
Go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Marcus and Jennifer, for your presentation. I had a question related to attachment F of the report, which is, well, it's page 44 of our agenda packet, which is quite large, but it's related to the indirect costs allocated to the RTIP. And there seems to be, quite a divergence amongst jurisdictions on these indirect costs. I'll just take Chula Vista, for example. They seem to be one of the higher, the higher amounts. Approximately 20% of their expenditures were allocated to indirect costs that were charged to TransNet. Is there any guidance or framework for understanding kind of what an appropriate level of indirect costs charged to TransNet would be? And then secondly, what is this bucket of indirect costs typically include? Is that soft costs, things like consulting and planning and things like that, as opposed to direct construction costs?
Yeah, I can take the first part of the question. This question comes up quite a bit. So the ordinance doesn't have any guidance on the limit of indirect costs that will be covered by TransNet, but the control for that is the methodology of the indirect cost allocation, which is judged by the auditors in terms of reasonableness. So that's the extent that it goes to through the ordinance. And Jennifer, do you know primarily what those indirect costs are composed of? Could you speak to that?
For each jurisdiction, it could be a little different because their accounting practices are different. So an indirect cost pool could include the cost of general government activities at the organization. So information systems, allocation of building cost, anything that's not directly allocated to the program itself, but is essential to support the employees that are working on the project. So traditionally it's a percentage of direct salary charges. And then within that pool is costs that are not directly charged to a project. So it can vary, and the methodology varies significantly between the entities. What we do is look at their calculation and make sure they're calculating it correctly. And we include in the report what their methodology is, generally speaking, and whether that methodology has been subject to an audit or approved by a federal cognizant agency.
Does that help, Jonathan?
It does, yes, thanks very much.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you bringing that up. That's something that we've talked about in the past quite a bit, and I think there's been a little bit of progress. But yeah, it always jumps out when you see some of those percentages, right? But I see Pedro's got his hand up.
I have another question. When looking at the agenda item, it talks about the next steps, and it says upon acceptance of the final report, it will issue reports for all agencies. Is this going to the either transportation committee or to the full board for any action or anything relating to the findings that need some, I guess, correction?
Yeah, so the acceptance of the final audit reports ends here, and then the results will be presented as part of the annual report, which then goes to the board. The findings, the action items for the findings have already been addressed at the past transportation committee meetings where, for example, NCTD, they excluded certain amounts to be eligible. And so that's already been accepted and the reports have been revised and we are now accepting the final version of the reports here.
So in essence, the cities that had some issues, they are in the process of doing some corrective actions.
Those corrective actions have already been presented and accepted. So, for example, City of San Marcos and Del Mar had a MOE deficit, and the corrective action was to present an exception to extend 3 more years to make up that MOE deficit by June 30, 2024. Those have already been accepted at the Transportation Committee. So that is the action they took. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, it does. It does. I understand that, but what happens if we get to those 3 years and they still haven't done the correction?
Right. Then they would be ineligible for the TransNet that they weren't able to make up, and we would take that out of their allocation.
Okay,
at
fair
that
enough.
point.
Thank you, Marcus.
Yeah. Yep.
Anything else, Pedro?
No, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions, comments from committee members? But then before we actually move to the vote, we've got a motion in a second. I just had one question, and I'm not sure if this is best for Marcus or Jennifer. Could you just refresh our memories, since it's been a little while since we had the first presentation, on what the issue was, the carryover issue was for Lemon Grove on the fee collection? I understand what the issue is. I'm curious about what their problem was and what the remediation plan is.
Yeah, I can go over that. So the city of Lemon Grove has to do with the exaction fee. It's a finding in, they undercollected the correct amount of the exaction fee. To be exact, this was $129 in under collection. And they've responded that they will make their best effort to collect it for the FY22 audits. So my understanding is that it had to do with the timing of when we send out those new fee notices and when they actually implement it. So the timing was kind of off. So I've been discussing with Ariana, and to give them better notice of this, we're gonna have more periodic reminders of the new fee in the future, so.
Right, so we currently provide, as soon as the board approves the new Regional Transportation Congestion Improvement Program fee, or that development impact fee, which is in February at their board meeting. As soon as they approve that, we send out a notice not only to the finance directors at each local jurisdiction, but also to the city managers, as well as the membership of the CTAC, which is the Cities and Counties Transportation Advisory Committee, which will now be known as the Mobility Working Group, I believe, which is made up of all the public works, city engineers, types of folks. And so we send out a notice to them leading up to the board approval of the new exaction fee, as well as after the board approves. What Marcus and I have discussed is that going forward, since we inevitably have like 1 or 2 jurisdictions each fiscal year as part of the audit that don't meet that requirement, is following up maybe on a quarterly basis throughout the fiscal year, leading up to the conclusion of the audits for that year, so that they are provided additional reminders, and hopefully that will help.
Great, thanks. I don't know if we previously discussed what that fix was going to be, but thanks. That was exactly the question I had. Okay, so we've got a motion second. I take it no other comments, questions. Can we tally the vote, please, clerk?
Thank you. For real estate right-of-way acquisition, Jonathan Frankel.
Oh, yes.
For licensed civil traffic engineer, Michael Kenny.
Yes.
For contractor construction, Pedro Orso Delgado.
Yes.
For biology environmental, Dustin Fuller.
Yes.
For finance and budgeting, Vice Chair Halpern.
Halpern, yes.
For licensed engineer, Les Hopper.
Yes.
And CEO private sector is absent. That item does pass unanimously with those members present.
Great, thank you. So next on our agenda is item number 9, but we've actually had a late breaking legal question come up on item 9. And since that's one that's already been discussed and we were looking for a recommendation, I think we're going to defer this one to the next meeting so that we can just get some additional legal clarification on one of the items, if that's okay with everybody. So I don't know, do we actually have to do that in a formal fashion, or can I just move on?
Vice Chair Halpern, we are going to actually present this item first.
Okay.
And let the whole ITALK discuss that, and then come up with the recommendation from the ITALK.
Okay, so then, Sarah, were you going to lead that discussion?
I actually can start it, and Mr. Jonathan Frankel, who's the chair of the subcommittee to consider TransNet ordinance amendments, will present this item. So Jonathan, would you like to take over this item?
Oh, yes, thank you, Zara. Good morning, fellow committee members. This is an update on our ongoing efforts related to amendments to the TransNet extension ordinance concerning the membership and selection process and here at ITALK. So as you know, as a reminder, our fiscal 21 triennial performance audit included recommendations specific to ITALK, and that's noted in the report. We formed a subcommittee on this issue and have met a number of times to consider potential amendments to implement the recommendations included in the triennial performance audit. 2 of those recommendations have been now drafted into formal ordinance amendments. One is related to adding 2 additional seats or positions to ITALK, one of which is an emerging technology position, and one of which is a transportation user position. We've also made some recommendations relative to the selection process, specifically the ITALK chair or vice chair or designee would serve as a non-voting member of the selection committee and would be involved in that process as well. So I think, notwithstanding the potential legal issue that Stuart has raised today, the item was requesting a recommendation to the board of directors that these amendments to the ordinance be adopted. And with that concludes my brief update.
Thanks. I guess we can ask for public comments and then we'll take up the discussion ourselves. Do we have any public member comments on or questions on this issue? I'm seeing none. I see Mike Kinney's got his hand raised. We move to committee member comments, questions. Mike?
Not to be difficult, but I think I'd prefer to hear what the issue is before I vote on the item.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, I was going to say, I don't know if we have who we have on the line who could speak to this from a governance standpoint or parliamentary process standpoint. If we could actually separate out the one part of this that has a little bit of an issue, and I can speak to, for full transparency, what it is. Part of our recommendation relating to the selection committee is to enlarge the pool of board member representatives to the selection committee to also include elected officials who are not members of the SANDAG board, but who are on policy advisory committees. And there's just a little bit of a quirky thing in the California government code when members are on 2 bodies. There's some specific perspectives as to what makes for a conflict. And the issue of conflict is exempted if you are a member of the board because that's expressly authorized by law. But there's a question as to whether the potential conflict would exist for somebody who is not a member of the board to both sit on the selection committee and also be representatives of their jurisdictions. So that's probably not the world's best explanation, but conceptually that's the general gist of what we were looking for a little bit of additional insight on, and I think probably before we vote on that. But a question is, since that is fairly specific to just a part of the amendments on the table, does anybody know? Can we do kind of a carve out, or should we just wait till next meeting?
Vice Chair House, you can definitely, the ITAC can separate out the items and vote on just the portion related to the 2 new membership categories, or you can put this all on a future agenda if the ITAC chooses to do that.
And Stuart, having heard your explanation, I don't care if the legal issue comes. If the legal opinion comes back and says, well, if you're not a SANDAG board member, you can't do this, that would be fine. And if they allow it, that would be fine by me as well. So I'm happy to take the issue as it's written, now that I understand what the issue was.
Pedro, any other?
So if I understand correctly, is it recommendation number 26, the one that's giving a little bit of a legal concern?
I don't actually have that in front of me, but I presume if number 26 is what I just described, then I guess, yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is related to recommendation number 26, which talks about the screening and selection process for ITAC members, which is proposed to be addressed, if you look at the attachment, by adding the, in addition to the mayor being able to serve from each subregion on the selection committee, the city council member that sits on the SANDAG board or one of the SANDAG policy advisory committees. That was the proposed addition to that section. So yes, it is related to recommendation number 26.
So if we pull that specific one, then we could take action.
You could take action on the 2 new membership categories. So the professional in a field of emerging transportation technology, and then also adding that transportation system user. So you could take action to make just those, to recommend that the board approve just those amendments, or we could bring this back to you at a future meeting and you could take it up then, the whole thing.
I would be okay doing just what Ariana said, of pulling those specific items and going ahead and voting on the balance of things.
So just as a point of information, process-wise, and sorry, Les, I'll just get to you in a second, but I just wanted to have this clarity. Process-wise, if we were to vote on that one part and defer voting on the second part, would there be any implication, Ariana, for actually how and when these things get presented to the board?
I mean, we could come back to your July meeting. The board and policy advisory committees, as well as the ITAC, are anticipated to be dark in August. So I think the earliest we would be able to bring anything forward to the board for your recommendation would probably be September. So I think we could still bring them back together, assuming we come back to you in July.
Yeah, I guess what I was getting at is my presumption, but correct me if I'm wrong, that the board would probably want to take these things together as opposed to one-off. So, but that being said, we can still approve the one for which there isn't any controversy or open question, if that's what people would like to do, and then just defer the second one and then bring them to the board together in the fall.
Yeah, I believe so, yes. And then my understanding is this something that you would want your legal counsel to take a look at?
Yeah, that was the idea.
Okay, so if that were potentially part of the if the motion is going to be something different, then perhaps we can add that in there as well.
Okay, so I saw Les had previously had his hand up, and then Jonathan's also raised his hand. I don't know, Les, did you still have a question or comment?
Yeah, I think you answered, or you asked my question, Stuart. I was really curious about the process. If we were going to do, I guess, your door number one, Ariana, where we pull that item, then we'd have an amendment to the amendment to get approved next time, after we go through the process, and then it would go to the board later, I think.
Yes,
So anyway, I think I got it.
Okay. All right. Jonathan, you have something.
Given if we bifurcate this on the two new categories, 2 new seats, and then the selection committee process, we're going to have to bring this back next month anyway. And given that we'll have the benefit potentially of additional information on the legal review, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me to bifurcate them at this time, given that there's not going to be any schedule impact on the overall presentation of both of these items to the board. So I'd like to make a motion to continue this item to a date certain of our July meeting.
Okay, we have that motion. Does anybody care to second that motion? Michael Kenny has his hand raised. Is that for a second or something else, Mike?
Yes, it is. I will second that motion.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Do we have any discussion or questions on that motion? If not, we can take that up. Clerk, if you would call the roll. And for clarity, tell me if I get it wrong, Jonathan, but the motion is basically to defer the entirety of this item to the July meeting.
That's correct.
And you would like your legal counsel to take a look at this, is my understanding, to your subcommittee to work with your legal counsel.
Right. That will necessarily have the council take a look and probably have to have a meeting, quick subcommittee meeting, just to get a reaction. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think are we ready for a vote?
Thank you. For real estate right-of-way acquisition, Jonathan Frankel.
Oh, yes.
For licensed civil traffic engineer, Michael Kenny.
Approve.
For contractor construction, Pedro Orso Delgado.
Agree.
For biology environmental, Dustin Fuller.
Yes.
For finance and budgeting, Vice Chair Halpern.
Halpern, yes.
For licensed engineer, Les Hopper.
I'm a yes.
Thank you. And CEO private sector is absent. And that item passes unanimously with those members present.
Great, thank you. Okay, so moving on to item 10, which is the TransNet grant program's quarterly status update. I know there are a number of staff members responsible for this, but is it Tracy that's going to lead the discussion?
Hey everyone, my name's Allie Newman. I'll be leading this presentation. Thank you. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. My name's Allie, as I mentioned, and I work in the SANDAG Grants Division. I'm going to present a quarterly update on our TransNet funded grant programs for the period of January through March 2022. And I wanted to let you know that I'm going to provide some time for questions at the end, so you can go ahead and write them down and save them for later. And I'll start off with our Environmental Mitigation Program, or EMP, first. Next slide, please. Great. So the EMP Land Management Grant Program funds land management projects that help to maintain and enhance the integrity of our regional habitat preserves. Our staff members that work on this are Courtney and Kim. And during this reporting period, they had 2 projects that were completed, and that was the Chaparral Lands Conservancy Otay Mesa Rare Plants Project and the Nature Collective North County Dunes 2 project. This program had 2 projects that were placed on the watch list. And that was the San Diego Audubon Society Silverwood and Steen project. And that was placed on the watch list due to not meeting prevailing wage requirements. This issue has been referred to the Department of Industrial Relations, and the project is complete and will be closed out once those labor compliance issues are resolved. The Chaparral Lands Conservancy Proctor Valley Vernal Pools and Uplands project was also placed on the watch list because they did not invoice in a timely manner during this period. And our one project did receive an amendment for the EMP program, and that was the Chaparral Lands Conservancy Rarest Plants 2 project. Next slide, please. So here is a photo from the EMP LMG program's completed projects. This is the Chaparral Lands Conservancy Otay Mesa Rare Plants project. It improved the conservation status of several of the county's rarest plants on important conserved lands in Otay Mesa. The project performed seed bulking concurrently with vernal pool restoration for 2 high priority plant species. It also created artificial burrows for western burrowing owls, which is a high priority animal species. Next slide, please. Okay, so here is a slide on our active transportation grant program, and that's a program that is under staff member Tracy's purview. This program provides funding for projects that improve safety and prioritize access for pedestrians and cyclists. During the reporting period, there were 2 completed projects, the City of San Diego's Streamview Drive Design Only project and the City of Solano Beach's Loma Santa Fe Corridor Active Transportation Improvements Design Only project. And there was 1 project placed on the watch list, and that was the City of La Mesa's Massachusetts Avenue and Blackton Drive pedestrian and bike improvements. And they were placed on the watch list because they did not meet prevailing wage requirements, which is similar to the a similar issue to the last program we talked about. And SANDAG is working with city staff on resolving those issues. Next slide, please. Okay, great. Now I'm going to show a project showcase slide, which has a photo from the Smart Growth Incentive Program, which is another project or program under Tracy's purview. And here is a picture of the constructed and extension of bike lanes along the length of Roosevelt Avenue. And it created custom bike corrals throughout National City. This project funded the creation of widened sidewalks, high visibility crosswalks, extended corner bulb outs, improved lighting and wayfinding elements. And all of those changes created improved walking conditions and cyclist safety. Next slide, please. Okay, so next I'll go over my senior mini grant program, which is a program that I help to facilitate. The senior mini grant program, or the SMG, funds innovative transportation services for older adults. During the reporting period, there were 4 grants from this program that were completed. The City of La Mesa's Rides for Neighbors operating program, the facilitating access to coordinated transportation. They had 2 programs for their consolidated transportation services and their brokerage management program that closed out. And Jewish Family Services had their operating program for on-the-go North County Inland. That project was a program was closed out on the senior mini grant. But the senior mini grant program is a little different from the other two programs that I've already described, in that these fund programs, operating programs. So there is a chance that these programs got refunded for the next funding cycle. So you might see them on future reports. Okay, and then we all for the senior mini grant program, we didn't have any amendments, but we had 3 operating grants that were on the watch list. We had the Jewish Family Services Eastern San Diego was on the watch list. Peninsula Shepherd Center's Out and About Senior Transportation Program and Travelers Aid's Senio Ride Program were all on the watch list. And that was because these programs are currently have some low spending going on, which means that all of these grants are not currently scheduled to end according to their current grant deadline. And the reason why this is because it's mostly because of COVID-19 related programs or problems, so such as low ridership, volunteer shortage, staff shortages. driver shortages. So SANDAG is communicating these issues to them, and their staff is trying to come up with innovative ways to increase their spending and end on time. Next slide, please. Great. And then here's a project showcase slide for the Senior Mini Grant program. Here's a photo from one of our SMG projects, the Jewish Family Services on the Go program. And that's a volunteer driver program that provides rides for seniors to go to the doctor or a grocery store, or even socialize with friends. This photo shows a client who liked the program so much, she decided to donate herself some money to the program in honor of her husband, whom she is holding a photo of. Next slide, please. Okay, so now it's moved on to the question slide. I want to thank you all for following along. I hope we showed you how these grant programs are making a difference on people and the planet. I will take any questions at this time. My grant staff are on the line now to take any questions regarding their corresponding programs. And City, I did want to mention that I think there was a slide missing because there is a City of La Mesa recommendation for an amendment. So I'm not sure what happened to that slide, but City of La Mesa is asking for an amendment, requesting an amendment for their program for the iTalk to approve today, but that slide was missing. I wonder if it was taken out because of the amendment. Is there anyone on the line who could help me with that? Slide, perhaps we could find that slide.
Yeah, I don't see, it's Jenny. Jenny is on.
Okay.
But it looks like she's muted.
That's okay.
Well,
I can read my notes for that.
Yeah, well,
slide.
yeah. So I don't know, Kendall, do we have the action slide for this item? It should be a recommend that the ITALC is asked to recommend the 9-month scheduled extension for the City of La Mesa.
If I could just interject, does the absence of that slide indicate that they're no longer interested in the extension, or is it just an omission of the slide?
I don't think so, because I see City of La Mesa is on the line today.
Correct. Yeah. So, and is the person's last name, is it Thorne?
I think it's Michael Thorne here.
Thorne? Okay. So I'm looking for him.
I'm here.
There you are. Okay, great. Fantastic. So Michael Thorne is available for any questions you might have.
For smart growth, yes. We have the Director of Public Works from the City of La Mesa here to answer any questions. As part of the report, we do include his letter requesting the amendment, and yeah, a 9-month amendment is still being requested. So if anybody has any questions, I'm sure Michael is here to answer them.
Great, thank you for clarifying that, Tracy. Before we go to committee member questions, comments, I see that we do have one public member comment. Dr. Bilash.
Thank you, Dr. Timothy Bilash from Central San Diego on the coast. I just had a comment about this. I found that report really interesting. I hadn't heard of some of these things. And just in general, I was wondering what the contact SANDAG has for these kind of activities with the local media in particular. It's the kind of things I think people would be interested in, and in the process of trying to improve communication between the different parts of the county, I think people would be surprised. And so I just wanted to make that comment, and thank you for the report.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure to be able to present it. I think the before and after pictures really help to show the difference that we are making. And any comments from the public on how we can improve the communications is something that we're looking for, because we always want to do that. We actually are in constant communication with communications so that we can show these photos, talk about, new funding cycles and any successes that we've shown. Thank you.
And if I could add to that, we also help to coordinate ribbon cuttings, we do have social media posts about these projects, kind of highlighting their milestones and the completion deadlines. Also, we do like I said, ribbon cutting situations, and I have seen media like news channels at these ceremonies. So yeah, we do try to get the word out. And thank you very much, Mr. Vilas, because I know that these are great projects, and I love that you recognize that they're great projects. Thank you.
Okay, so turning to member comments and discussions, this item is one in which we're asked for a recommendation to approve the La Mesa request. So administratively, perhaps we can see if we have a motion to approve in a second, after which we can have discussion, or if not, then we could see if discussion will illuminate us to the point where we'll have a motion. We've got a couple of hands up. I don't know who is first, but I'll go to you, Pedro.
My question, Ali, has to do with the projects that are on the watch list because of the prevailing wage. I'm assuming that those projects have been completed as far as the construction, and now administratively you're looking at how much they paid. Where I'm of concern is that don't the contracts for the construction of these projects talk about prevailing wage being paid to the workers? And what happens if they don't?
Thank you. I'll defer to Tracy or Courtney or Kim for those, because they have those prevailing wage issues, whereas mine are operating programs for older adults. Thank you.
I can speak to the EAP programs. So specifically, it is written into the contract and the agreement that prevailing wage is a requirement depending on the type of work. Unfortunately, our subcontractor, which is the San Diego Audubon Society, was unaware that their activities was going to include prevailing wage work. So when a Sandag subcontractor of GAFCON, who monitors the prevailing wage, was made aware of this issue, that's what then started the process, because it was identified near the end of the project.
But
and I believe
happens?
Jenny Russo can provide any more specific details on that process as well.
Hi, Pedro. I'm happy to take the question.
Hi, Jenny.
We do have language in our grant agreements about prevailing wage. It's pretty lengthy, as you would imagine, knowing how prevailing wage works. So all of our projects are monitored for prevailing wage requirements. Some of these issues, honestly, are not about payment of prevailing wage to workers. It's more about all the paperwork and the documentation that's required, making sure they're filing all the proper forms, they're doing it timely. That's the bulk of what these issues are. And a lot of it is just requiring us to do more education to our contractors and our grantees, reminding them what the requirements are. Certainly nonprofits are not as used to working with prevailing wage as some of the others are. So that's primarily what you're seeing, is sort of this bubbling up of groups that aren't as used to working with it. On the city level, obviously, they're a lot more nuanced and used to what prevailing wage is. So for those, we kind of monitor them a little bit differently than we do on the nonprofit side. But yeah, most of it has nothing to do with payment for workers. It's not on the worker level. It's truly about paperwork, processing, timely documentation, that sort of thing. So we're still working with them. We're doing some enhancements to our outreach to our grantees, you know, on the pre-side when they're applying for projects, so they know what the requirements are, and then post-award working with them, you know, weekly, quarterly, monthly, whatever it needs to do to get them to comply.
Thank you, Jenny.
You're welcome.
Michael?
Question for Mr. Throne. Would you be willing to take a question about your letter?
Absolutely.
I did read your letter. Thank you for that. I understand that your Complete Streets manual went a little long because you wanted to get more public input through that process. But you think you're going to have it to the council on August 3rd?
I will have it to the to the council toward the end of this calendar year or very early next calendar year?
Well, it doesn't matter how much public outreach you do, you always get beat up for not doing enough. So if this was an effort to incorporate more public outreach, that's certainly understandable. So thank you for the letter.
Thank you.
Do we have any other comments, questions? We have been asked for a recommendation on this item, so still looking if we have a motion. Jonathan's hand is up. Is that for a motion?
Yes, I'd like to make a motion to approve staff recommendation to grant the extension to the city of La Mesa. Just also want to note that I'm a resident of the city of La Mesa. I bike there all the time. So I appreciate Director Throne being here, and anybody that has not seen the improvements on University or elsewhere in town, come down to the village and check it out. The city's been doing a ton related to bike infrastructure, and this actually design manual, I think, is going to be really helpful. So I would enthusiastically support the recommendation.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Pedro. Just beat Michael under the wire there. So we have a motion, we have a second. Can we call the roll, please, clerk?
Thank you. For real estate right-of-way acquisition, Jonathan Frankel.
Oh, yes.
For licensed civil traffic engineer, Michael Kenny.
Approve.
Excuse me. For contractor construction, Pedro Orso Delgado.
Approve.
For biology environmental, Dustin Fuller.
Approve.
For finance budgeting, Vice Chair Halpern.
With full confidence in my colleague, Mr. Frankel, also an enthusiastic yes.
For licensed engineer, Les Hopper.
Approve.
And CEO private sector is absent. And with that, that item passes unanimously with those members present.
Great, thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Throne, and to the staff. So now we're on item number 11, which is the fiscal 2022 ITOC goals status update. And Zara, I believe you're going to introduce this. This is a discussion item.
Yes, Vice Chair Halpern, I'm going to present an update on the status of FY 2022 ITOC goals. In September 2021, ITOC members approved the FY 2022 goals for the ITOC. The ITOC also established two subcommittees to address these goals. The subcommittee on regional safety, consisting of Mr. Michael Kenny as the subcommittee chair, Mr. Pedro Orso Delgado, and Mr. Les Hopper, and the subcommittee to consider TransNet ordinance amendments, consisting of Mr. Jonathan Frankel as the subcommittee chair, Chair Sonny House, and Vice Chair Stuart Halpern. In terms of progress since your last meeting, the Regional Safety Subcommittee met in May, and a draft introductory report on peer agency best practices is being provided to you today. In addition, the subcommittee to consider TransNet ordinance amendments also met in May, and an update on the status of the amendments of the ITOC membership and selection process was provided to the ITOC today, as well as agenda item number 9. In terms of overall progress, since the ITOC set goals in September, several TransNet recipient agencies have made presentations on their TransNet funded projects. There have also been presentations on implementation of safety-related audit recommendations and ITOC discussions on other areas related to the FY 2022 ITOC SANDAG goals. As we get close to the end of the fiscal year, we are asking this committee to consider whether setting goals was an effective way to ensure compliance with ITOC's roles and responsibilities. That concludes my presentation, and we are available to answer any questions the committee might have. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Zara. Before we go to committee member discussion, do we have any public comments on this item? I am not seeing any hands raised, and so I'll turn it over to the committee. Again, this is a discussion item. Do we have any thoughts, comments, questions? I'll just throw it out, because Zara, you did ask the question. I'm a fan of having goals and objectives, and I thought this is a really nice innovation that I believe Sunny had had proposed. So I think it's working well. I don't know if others have thoughts. Apparently not. Okay, thank you, Sarah,
Thank you.
for presenting this item. We'll move on to item number 12 is the 2021 State of the Commute Report, and Grace is going to be presenting this. This is discussion and possible action.
Good morning, ITAC committee members. Thanks for having me today. We're going to go over the 2021 State of the Commute info bits. Next slide, please. Just to give an overview of what we're going to be doing today, I'll just give a quick background of the TransNet ordinance and State of the Commute, changes that were made to the 2021 State of the Commute info bit, the overall results from the 2021 State of the Commute, and then we'll talk about next steps and plans that we have for the 2022 State of the Commute. Next slide, please. So I always like to just start with this slide and give a background on the ITAC's role. It's stated in the TransNet ordinance that on an annual basis, the ITAC will review ongoing Sandex system performance evaluation, including Sandex State of the Commute report, and provide an independent analysis of information included in that report. This evaluation process is expected to include factors such as level of service measurements by roadway segment and by time of day, throughput in major travel corridors, and travel time comparisons by mode between major trip origins and destinations, and that the information will be used as a tool in the RTP development process. Next slide. And so the background of the State of the Commute, it started back in 2005. Again, Caltrans, MTS, MTTD, and Sandex staff defined the performance measure indicators for the report, and since then completed 10 reports and 4 info bits, and that's because certain years were collapsed. Again, this report started off as like a 50 to 60 page report, and now we've pared it down in the most recent years, and I think we've pared it a little. I think it's been increasing in page size due to added performance measures, but again, long-term big picture, we hope that this report will no longer be a static flat file of a PDF, but will become a dynamic interactive dashboard that will be updated on a more regular basis. Next slide, please. And so the process of changes that were made for the current State of the Commute was that we met with the State of the Commute subcommittee, which consisted of Les Hopper, Dustin Fuller, and Mike Kinney, and just want to thank them for their time spent on this. The feedback that we received was to make changes to the last State of the Commute info bit, and with those changes, we added tables for traffic volumes. We also added regional safety numbers, which was recommended from the fiscal year 18 triennial audit. We were told that the map that reflected the commute times was crowded, and so that we broke the map apart into 2 maps to reflect morning and evening peak commute times. And then on the actual infograph itself, we revised the bike numbers to be a table instead of a graph because we were given feedback that the graph was a bit confusing. And so we just broke it apart to be a table instead. And then we provided an overall draft to the ITAC subcommittee on May 9th, 2022, and they were given an extra few weeks to review the draft and provide their feedback. Next slide, please. And so just the overall results that we want to share was that 2020, these results were compared to 2020, and in 2021, peak travel time was up 11%. And highway travel times on the 16 commute corridors were also up. And then transit travel times did not change on 15 of the 16 selected routes. Ridership on transit did increase slightly by 3% from 2020. Bike activity across the 8 bike routes decreased by 14%, and anecdotal evidence has been said that in 2020, there was more time and people for biking leisurely versus for commutes. And then in 2021, 211,000 one-way passenger trips occurred through the Senior Mini Grant Program. Next slide, please. And so again, just want to reiterate that again, 2021, peak travel time on our highways were increasing and went up to 11.2%. We're not back to where we were pre-pandemic, but it is increasing again. Next slide, please. This is a table with a lot of data, but this was just the new table that we added for traffic volumes. And so basically these tables were to show both for AM and PM peak times that it is again going up on major routes in our county. However, we're not back to where we were 5 years ago in 2017. And so again, 2020, our pandemic year where, you know, we had the stay-at-home orders, and then now we were just comparing to 2021 that we are going back up, but we are not where we were 5 years ago. Next slide, please. And so another new data point that we added to this info bit, again, just to reiterate that we were being responsive to the fiscal year 18 triennial audit, was to include safety data in our region. And so car crash severity, we had 264 fatal collisions in 2021. And as you can see, parties involved in car crashes, we had 7% of those crashes involved a pedestrian, 5% of total crashes were bike involved, and about 11% of total crashes were motorcycle involved. Next slide, please. And so this was the morning transit travel times on major corridors, on major commute corridors. And so out of the 12 selected corridors for highway travel, 4 had decreases, 5 had increases, and 3 had no change. Out of the 8 transit routes, 7 had no changes and 1 had an increase. Next slide, please. For our evening commute, evening highway and transit travel times, we had, of the 12, we had 10 that had decreases and 2 that had no change for highway. And then out of the 8 transit routes, 8 had no change for the PM commute. Next slide, please. And so, as I had mentioned in the beginning, transit ridership slightly increased in 2021. And I want to take note that in 2021, we had opened the Mid-Coast Blue Line corridor. And so that may have helped. And also in 2021, we finally officially opened our borders again back with Mexico after the shutdown with COVID. And so I'm anecdotally alluding that we may have had an increase due to those 2 major events that happened in 2021. Next slide, please. And so here is our regional rail. This one specifically are rail lines. And you can see in the green that 2021, we had increases for the blue line and the green line. Not so much on Orange and Sprinter and Coaster, but Coaster, there was a slight increase. I apologize. And so we're inching back up. Next slide, please. And then this is our bus transit ridership. These are our rapids. And so not where we were, but we're actually lower in 2021 than we were in 2020. So I'm not quite sure why, but I will get an answer to that. But overall for transit ridership for the region, we are up because of our rail. Next slide, please. And so for next steps for the 2022 State of the Commute, we are procuring streetlight data for volumes on arterial roads. That's again to be responsive to the triennial audit. We're currently working on dashboards for bridge and pavement in the interim. We were awarded a Caltrans planning grant to modernize the automated passenger counter software that is on our buses and transit. And so that plus additional funds that we had reserved for fiscal year 23, we're going to use that money to procure a new system that adds up all of our data and then we're going to make sure to push out dashboards that would show current ridership on a more frequent level. And we're partnering with MTS and NCTD. And they will be involved in the whole process. We will be doing an RFP to select a new vendor. We will be working together to ensure that it meets all of our requirements and that we can share the data on all of our websites as well. And then Long-term, big picture, 2022 State of the Commute will transition from a static report to a dynamic dashboard. We are in the early phases of that. We have interim dashboards. And what I mean by interim dashboards is that we're using Power BI right now. We may end up using another software to have a more dynamic dashboard, but we are also launching, SANDAG as an agency will be launching an ODP, which is our open data portal. And that's being, as we speak, it's being built and tested. We have a pilot project going on right now. And then after that pilot project is done, performance monitoring in the state of the commute is next in line as a use case. And so again, we're going to have an interim dashboard if our ODP isn't ready to launch by the next state of the commute. But in case the next state of the commute is ready to launch, we'll be using it through SANDAG's open data portal. Next slide. So I just want to take any questions from the committee members if there are any.
Maybe before we do that, we can check to see. I see actually Dr. Bailash has his hand raised. So for public comments, Dr. Bailash.
Thank you for taking my comments. Dr. Tim Bailash from Central County Coast. I'm a physician and a scientist, so I hope it informs these. Thank you, Grace Mino and the staff for that very impressive report. And I'm appreciative of what I see as extra effort made to make it accessible to the uninformed like me. I was just wondering if the travel times listings were accounted for in construction delays. Some of those areas appeared to me that they were under intense construction during some of these time periods. So it might, in terms of interpreting the future consequence of that. The second thing, I'd like to make a comment on the bike decrease of 14%. I'm a physician, and I've been a little critical of our pandemic responses across the board over the last few years. And so I'd be interested where the transportation agencies, because there's their multitude, where they get input for instructions and making decisions, because mass transportation in particular is a concern in a pandemic environment. And I wanted to highlight the difference between the ability for an individual to take responsibility and protection on their own versus arresting citizens for not getting with the program. As an example, right now, my understanding is that the CDC has lifted travel restrictions on airlines, but I was in the hospital the other day and everybody's wearing masks. So is there any consideration looking at how to avoid and deal with confusion and future conflicts from all the fear and recommendations that come out, because it severely inhibits mass transportation? In particular, as far as I know, bike riding is outdoors. And the initial conflicts between going outside was dangerous, staying inside is dangerous. I don't think they've ever really been addressed, and I think it's something to look at for future situations. Thank you for taking my comments.
Thank you, Dr. Bailash. Going to committee member comments and questions. Anybody? I see Michael Kenny has his hand raised. Yes, Mike.
Grace, thanks for the presentation. I guess this will be another year where we'll look back on it and see the impacts of COVID. It's hard to tell what the commute is actually doing when it has that pressure of low volume and high speed. It'd be interesting to see if some sectors ever bounce back, but I guess we won't know that for a few years as well. The move to VMT instead of delay or travel time, is that on the horizon? Is that next year, 5 years from now? I mean, we have the ordinance that says we're going to report things in terms of delay, so it would be an ordinance change. But as the industry shifts away from delay, do we have any plans on incorporating vehicle miles traveled as opposed to delay for a metric?
We still report VMT overall. That was our 11.2% increase of last year. Through the TransNet ordinance, amendments. My understanding is that we're going to make reporting consistent across. So as that process proceeds, we will find a consistent way to report whatever it is we need to report moving forward. And it will be captured through our ERP or enterprise resource planning tool.
Okay. And thank you. So second question would concerning the accident data or the collision data, those were percentages reported from the previous year. Is there any, do we have that historical data?
We do. And so in the background, while we are building a safety dashboard, we have about 15 years of SWTR's safety data, and we've been working with the CHP. We've been doing this in the background because it's not ready to launch yet, but we are overlaying our SWTR's data with GIS mapping data. Our staff right now is trying to work with, there's a good number of data missing latitude and longitudinal points. And so they're doing the manual process of finding the cross streets and then moving it to the closest of where the incident happened. There's a few, I want to say a few thousand records that might be like that, because again, we're looking at about a 10 to 15 year data span. And so, but yes, we plan to have more updated safety data, again, in an interactive form through a dashboard. It is currently being built, and then we will be showing it once it's ready for release, but we're not at that point yet.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. Pedro?
I've been trying to figure out how to ask this question, and I'm not sure I got it 100% right, but here it goes. One of the things that I understand is that we talk about the impact that COVID has had on the commute. And I realize that, you know, for all of the reasons, but COVID also has had an interesting secondary impact, and we see it right now with this meeting that we're having, the ability to do things online. And I think that in some ways is going to stay with us, because I think industry has learned to trust their employees, and you know, boards and committees and commissions have figured out that this is a way to do business. So this is a roundabout way of asking this question. With Sandag's capability of data analytics, have you guys thought about not just saying, well, it hasn't reached the levels of pre-COVID, but the impact that it has industry-wise, because the industry has adjusted and some people will not need to commute anymore? Is there a way to try to capture that information? Because I think in the future, that's going to be really relevant for our transportation decisions, knowing, you know, the flexibility that the workforce has nowadays, and trying to compare it to historical data that we had in the past.
Thank you so much for your question, Pedro. And actually, yes, we have two large data collection efforts. One has just actually is in it's about to end right now. It's the small sample household travel behavior survey. Normally we do one every 10 years. It helps feed our activity-based model, but because it costs so much to do such a study once every 10 years, and then the data gets outdated by like 2 to 3 years afterwards, we decided to move to a more regular and ongoing data collection process where we will try to, we will do one every other year. But because we are in such a weird time, as you had mentioned, with COVID and, you know, people being told to stay home or come back to the office, or, you know, different policies changing in the workplace with remote or hybrid or come in, you know, we are in the right now conducting the small sample household travel behavior survey with, and right now, when I last looked yesterday, we had about 2,700 households in the San Diego region who participated, and we did ask COVID and workplace and commute related questions. Also, We're doing a second part to the study in spring of next year that will also add to the more information towards that. And then next year we did one in 2021, and then we're going to do it again in 2023. We did a telework survey for both businesses and residents to ask about how percentage of people working from home pre-COVID, during COVID, and what they anticipate post-COVID. And so we're going to compare the two to see if any changes have been made with remote work policies and how that's impacted residents' travel when it comes to going to work or school. So it is being captured. We just don't have it at this moment right now.
Thank you, Grace. I think one of the things that would be very useful in the future, I know it can't happen right away, but making a connection to the impact that it has on the transportation. Not just knowing, but how is it affecting our corridors, our transit ridership, our bike ridership, and things along those lines.
Another thing I do want to mention that we had to postpone was our we were doing our onboard transit passenger survey prior to COVID starting. I mean, we were literally, our consultant was in the field, and then we had to stop data collection because of COVID. And so that's going to resume this fall and spring. And so that's where we will be adding COVID related questions onto that as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Grace.
You're welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Grace. And also thank you to Les, Dustin, and Mike for serving on the subcommittee. This is listed as possible action. Is there a desire to have the committee contemplate a recommendation for the board transportation committee or something else? Can somebody help me know what the possible action might have been?
I'll ask Ariana for that. Do we want this to be recommended to be moved forward, or do we just want the ITAC to accept the full ITAC to accept the state of the commute report?
Right. So I think the ITAC's role is really to review the state of the commute on an annual basis. It's not that an action necessarily needs to be taken. I think the reason it may have been listed as discussion possible action was in case there were any changes that the ITAC might propose in its final review based on the subcommittee initial review.
Great. Okay. So I think then we're ready to move on. Thank you again, Grace and subcommittee. So item number 13 is the peer agency safety program review. And I think, is Sam going to lead this? Ready to go, Sam, if you are.
Great, thank you. And good morning, everyone. And you should be seeing a screen right now for peer agency safety program review. Is that sharing properly? Wonderful. Well, good morning, everyone. And thank you, Chair, Vice Chair Halpern, ITAC members for having us here today to share information on the peer agency safety programs. My name is Sam Sanford, and I'm joined today by my colleague, America Aceves. We're from the Intergovernmental Coordination Team. We'll be co-presenting on this item. Before diving into it, first, I really want to thank the ITAC Subcommittee on Regional Safety, so Mr. Kenny, Orso, and Hopper, for their leadership and guidance getting this report much further than it would have been. So really appreciate their help. So staff has coordinated with the ITAC Subcommittee on Regional Safety to bring this introductory report to the ITAC, and it includes best practices by peer agencies, and also an update on status of safety plans at local agencies or local cities and our county in the San Diego region. So today's presentation will start with some background and context. Really, it's interesting to see how involved ITAC has been in safety for the past several years, and really leading in safety to the point of establishing the subcommittee on safety for the region and setting it in the fiscal 2022 goals and so forth. Within that background, we'll also cover the purpose of the research, where this came from. The safety program overview includes highlights from other metropolitan planning organizations or MPOs like SANDAG. It also has the status of local agency safety planning efforts. And then when we get into next steps, our next planned steps and possible future opportunities. And lastly, we'll get to the discussion, and this is a discussion possible action item. And with that intro, I'll turn it over to America to lead us through the background section.
Thank you, Sam. Good morning, Vice Chair Halper and other ITALK members. Again, my name is America Seves, and I'll be giving you a brief background on how we arrived to this agenda item, our research process, and some of the results from our research. So we'll begin by sharing a timeline on the Triennial Performance Audit, or the TPA safety recommendations and adopted ITAC safety goals on this slide. In the 2018 TPA report, it was recommended that SANDAG establish a comprehensive performance framework, including safety metrics, targets, monitoring, and regular reporting. This happens to coincide with the federal performance measures, which followed in the following year. Starting in 2019, staff began briefing federal safety performance targets to ITALK for discussion. These reinforced the efforts from the TPA report. The 2021 TPA additionally identified the need for a regional safety planning coordinator to help further synchronizing safety efforts of the region and regularly communicate progress being made on the safety goals to the board and to ITALK. The audit report also included the need to identify best practices by other peer agencies on their safety efforts. These audit recommendations were adopted in the ITALK's 2022 goals to work with SANDAG staff to develop an introductory report that includes best practices employed by peer agencies and present these findings by June of 2022. Since then, we have worked on collecting research from various metropolitan planning organizations to develop the safety report, which is included as attachment 1. We also collected local safety plans from local jurisdictions, which Sam will further present on, and that is included as attachment 2. So this timeline also reflects SANDAG's ongoing efforts to report to ITALK on the federal safety targets to the most recent 22 targets. Next slide, please. So this report on safety research is one of many safety efforts we have already shared on the TPA and federal transportation performance management efforts. We have also been working with our data safety team on onboarding safety data by incorporating data from the statewide integrated traffic record system, also known as SWITRS. So SWITRS is a tool used by the California Highway Patrol staff and members of its island agencies throughout California, where these agencies can request various types of statistical reports from gathered data at a collision scene in an electronic format. Currently, the scattered information is in our database, and we are working on geolocating the information to enhance our safety analysis. This information will also be presented at a future ITALK meeting. The 2021 regional plan included implementation actions under Appendix B. Implementation actions are activities that SANDAG is expected to significantly advance or complete prior to the next regional plan. The 2021 regional plan includes 10 near-term and accounting actions, including the creation of a Vision Zero action plan and safety policy. The peer agency safety research guided by ITALK will be used to support in developing these activities. And Sam will talk later about efforts currently underway to further support this near-term action. Next slide, please. Okay, now, so we will share our process in collecting our safety research. Since 2021, we have worked with the ITALK subcommittee on regional safety to help guide our safety research and develop our MPO safety program report and supporting documents. The timeline we will be sharing demonstrates these efforts. So we met with the ITALK subcommittee throughout our research process. In September of last year, we met with the ITALK subcommittee and discussed the ITALK safety goals. This discussion helped our research efforts moving forward. We also met with the ITALK subcommittee in February and May of this year, where we gathered their recommendations and feedback. And throughout this effort, we were able to finalize our safety research report, leading up to today with providing you with our full report and presentation. So thank you to the ITALK subcommittee on regional safety for your guidance. In our next slide, we will share further on which peer agencies we researched. So in beginning our research, we identified criteria to help us determining which MPOs to research. The MPOs we selected were similar in geographical size to SANDAG. We also included all major California MPOs and MPOs at a state that were larger than SANDAG to analyze their safety process, including some MPOs that had a reputation of incorporating successful Vision Zero policy. Our developed criteria and the feedback from the ITAC subcommittee assisted us to identify 5 of the MPOs to further our island research through discussions with peer agencies. On this map, we have the 5 MPOs listed, starting with the Southern California Association of Governments, or SCAG, in the Los Angeles region, where we learned further about their Go Human campaign on engagement and education. In the Bay Area, we spoke with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, or MTC staff. They have adopted a Vision Zero policy and developed a regional safety data system. And then within the state of Colorado, we talked to the Denver Regional Council of Governments, or DRCOG staff. They focus on data sharing and developing tools for their local jurisdictions to support the advancement of their safety projects in their region. We also had discussions with the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, or DVRPC staff, in the Pennsylvania area, where they developed the Regional Safety Task Force. So their task force conducted a year-long focus on safety culture framework, which encourages moving away from individual responsibility and moving towards focusing more on collective norms and values. And finally, we spoke with the Boston Regional Metropolitan Planning Organization, or BMP staff, in Massachusetts, where we learned that they are also currently having conversations on adopting a Vision Zero policy in their region. So along with these 5 MPOs, we also did online research on 11 additional MPOs on their safety policy, programs, and funding sources. In total, we did research on 16 MPOs nationwide. So this is just some brief background on what we found through our safety research. More can be found in our safety report. And so now we'll hand it back to Sam, who will share further details on our findings. Thank you.
Thank you, America. All right, so through our research discussions with the 5 MPOs America just highlighted, and then the 11 that we did online research for, we're able to identify some key findings, best practices from these other metropolitan planning organizations, or MPOs. And this is essentially a bulleted summary of those findings. And more is included in attachment 1 of this item's report. Looking at the very first bullet here on beginning with collecting safety data and developing a safety database. This is kind of one of the first items that most MPOs spoke to, where they started as a key first step. And it gets back to that prior item with Grace presenting on the state of the commute and work on safety as well. So SANDAG has initiated this process of getting SWITR's data on board and understanding it better, cleaning it, and then working on putting it into a geographic information system. So this is underway. Many of the MPOs we spoke to then used and leveraged that data to go into strategies such as developing a high injury network, which identifies segments of roadways that have higher propensity for different crashes, and then also looking at the characteristics of those crashes to identify countermeasures and other elements to address those. One aspect on this first bullet here that some MPOs spoke to was the benefit of centralizing the data collection at an MPO or at a regional level. The idea being that alleviated jurisdictions from having to go through and doing data collection, database development and management, and then analysis. So those resources that would have been spent on that can then be repurposed towards implementing projects, getting those countermeasures on the roadways as opposed to just doing the data analysis. So there's a little bit of economy of scale with having that data in one location and being analyzed on behalf or for the benefit of the region, as opposed to having, in our case, it would be potentially 18 cities in the county doing it separately. Second bullet on here is prioritization of equity. This is a big one. for Sandag and its commitment to equity, but it's also one of the best practices we saw. And now within federal DOT and all the federal divisions, it is a priority for them and a requirement for many of their programs. And this gets to addressing how analysis is conducted, but also where and how countermeasures are implemented into the transportation system, that is taken into account in both the development of the process and the implementation of countermeasures. On a third bullet, the regional coordination through multidisciplinary safety task force. This is all the MPOs that have a safety program have some body, a task force, a committee, something where stakeholders, electeds, and others can convene and discuss safety matters. It's a way to continue to further discussion on safety and bring important matters for action or information for participants. A Vision Zero plan or policy was a key element for many of the agencies, as it was a document or it was a guidepost for staff and member agencies to point to, okay, this is where we are going and here are the steps we need to take in order to achieve that goal. Fifth bullet down on the comprehensive approach to addressing safety. So here we have the E's that are often mentioned for education enforcement. That would be engineering and emergency response as well, in addition to infrastructure policy and funding. So this is a multidisciplinary approach to it. And MPOs are well positioned for that multidisciplinary approach, where we are often a convener or coordinator between multiple agencies in a region. And the idea with comprehensive approach is that there is no one solution to safety. It takes multiple different strategies coming from different divisions or practices in order to enable change. Second to last bullet here, include safety criteria in project evaluation. So it's not just identifying a project or drafting a wonderful plan. There needs to be steps to implement those. Some MPOs brought that in through project evaluation through either a call for projects or as projects move into the programming phase or in the planning phase of their regional transportation plan, that there was a safety element in there. For some, it was guidance, as in it just informed the process, but for others, it actually was an enforceable piece where they had to have some safety element to advance forward. And last but not least was this technical assistance and funding for local agencies. So this is again a role for a regional or some body that's multi-jurisdictional to provide that technical assistance. And again, this is gets to that economy of scale idea where you have expertise that's dedicated to this area that then can support multiple jurisdictions at the same time, with the idea that it can enable those jurisdictions to be very competitive to bring outside funds to the region and help achieve the common goal of zero fatalities. So that was the attachment 1 summary of this report. The second attachment, attachment 2, looks at local agency safety plans. So the safety plans for our cities and our county. In general, what we see is a very diverse set of plans of different sophistication. Many of them are focused on fulfilling requirements for the Highway Safety Improvement Program, or HSIP. And this is the traditional funding source for capital safety projects. And there's some requirements there for safety plans. And that's what most of the jurisdictions are developing, safety plans in order to maintain eligibility for that. So we saw several cities have completed safety plans or are in the process of updating their safety plans. A few have Vision Zero resolutions. A couple others were unknown. A full list of all the cities is included in attachment 2. And for this, this information was derived, and so as of May this was last updated, and attachment 2 was updated. The work involved looking at board minutes or city council minutes, committees, memos, essentially to understand where the cities are, in addition to reaching out to their staff. So now transitioning to the next steps and opportunity section. So on next steps, staff will be going to the joint meeting of the Transportation and Regional Planning Committee on July 15th to provide a safety update. at that meeting. And then on July 22nd, staff will be going to the board of directors, and the board of directors will be asked to adopt a Vision Zero resolution. Now, and continued on those next steps is a safety data portal. So staff is continuing to work on this, and this is something that America said early in the meeting, and also was mentioned in the prior item by Grace. The data is in-house and being worked on to develop a database, and then that will evolve into a safety data portal. We're working with our stakeholders to best understand how to make that as functional and useful as possible for them. And last but not least on this bullet is that Vision Zero task force. So staff has begun discussions to tease out ideas of what would that task force shape look like and what would membership be. We see it as being a very broad coalition of members, but that's part of our next steps to work on. For opportunities, had we had this meeting a month ago, or had this item come to the ITALK a month ago, this would have been a very different section. But things are moving very quickly, and there's exciting new opportunities that have just really been published less than a month ago now. And those primarily consist of the Safe Streets and Roads for All, or SS4A is their tagline. And this is a federal discretionary fund that came from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or bill, or IIJA is another acronym it goes by. It includes planning and capital or implementation funds. However, in order to get an implementation grant, the project must be identified through a qualifying safety plan. And it really brings us to the opportunity for a regional Vision Zero action plan. The thought going forward is that through this process, the region, the Sandag region, could develop a Vision Zero plan in this first call for grants under the Safe Streets for All, which is the fiscal year or for 2022. And then we would be able to apply for implementation grants in 2024. And this funding source continues through 2026. So it would essentially allow for 3 cycles of implementation grants. When I say we could apply for implementation grants, that would be the entire region. So the cities, the county, and the tribes under this framework would be eligible for applying for implementation grants during the last 3 years of this grant cycle. Additionally, this would help jurisdictions stay eligible for Highway Safety Improvement Program capital projects. And also another funding source is the Office of Traffic Safety, which primarily focuses on programs and education and enforcement as well. So all that being said, this is really an opportunity for ITALK to continue its leadership in the important area of safety. And this is a discussion item with a possible action, as was similar to when we brought the 2022 safety targets to the ITALK as just a discussion item, and ITALK took it upon themselves to make a recommendation for those targets, and also push staff to further safety planning efforts for the region. So with that, I'll happily turn it back to Vice Chair Halpern to help us with the discussion, or I'm happy to take any questions or comments as well.
Great, thank you, Sam and America. At this point, I'll just ask if we have any public comments. I'm seeing a hand raised, Dr. Bylash.
Thank you once again for taking entertaining my comments. One of the things I wonder when I look at safety data over different meetings, and whether the safety data collection captures particular equipment issues that might pop up as being recurring in the different areas, a type of accidents in particular, and whether also personal impairment is contributing to that. Different age groups have different perspectives sometimes in how they pay attention or not, and that's just something that I don't think some of the agencies are capturing as well. Perhaps there's some way, I'm not saying it's easy, but that might be separating it out from issues of the transportation infrastructure issues and mediation of that. Thank you once again.
Thank you for your comments. I will ask if my colleagues on the committee have any questions or comments. The other thing I would just want to throw out there as you're thinking of questions or comments is that, as Sam alluded to, the fact that part of this work came out of the ITOC's triennial performance audit, highlighting some questions relating to the safety data trends. And so given ITOC's leadership in this area, I would just throw out to my colleagues to consider, even though there's not a request for, or doesn't demand a particular action item, but rather that we might consider just a formal endorsement of these efforts and express our interest that the Board and Transportation Committee similarly look to continue these efforts. But with that said, I'll ask my colleagues if anybody has any questions or comments. I see Jonathan.
Thanks very much. Stuart, Sam, America, thank you very much for your presentation. I think this is some really interesting data here. One of the things that I think is really important and will be very valuable for our policymakers in determining how to implement potential improvements to address safety concerns is the data portal. And specifically, it looks like MTC developed what they call the High Injury Network, or HIN, which really identified that there were very few streets where a lot of crashes were happening, right? 75% of their severe fatal crashes were happening on 13% of streets. And so I would just like to encourage you to analyze how we can work with our local jurisdictions. It seems like there's some potential federal funding now available, which is exciting, to help advance the collection of this data to really understand where these problem areas exist. And I think there's probably widespread agreement that making these improvements would be a priority for most of our local elected officials. They just may not know where these improvements are needed. So would encourage you to work to implement that component, and would be happy to support Stuart's suggestion that we make a motion to kind of formally recognize or endorse ongoing efforts related to safety planning.
Thank you. Can we take that as a motion to endorse the effort, Jonathan? Putting words in your mouth a little bit.
Yes. Thank you, Stuart. It's absolutely.
Thanks, Jonathan. So Michael, you have your hand raised. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Exciting. Let me throw my video too. Come on, video. That's not coming on. Oh, there we go. Exciting information about the SS4A. I got too many things open here. I saw that you had made comments about applying for it, but is SANDAG not going to administer those funds? Who is going to be the agency that gets to administer those funds?
So thank you for the question. And the way we see this currently is that we would apply for planning. There's two segments of this grant, right? There's planning funds and there's implementation funds. Currently, SANDAG is only eligible to apply for the planning side because we do not have a regional safety plan that qualifies to pursue the implementation side. So SANDAG would apply for the planning funds, and when you say administer, we essentially be the applicant, hopefully with other, with the rest of the region as partners or co-applicants, to develop a regional plan that would be administered by SANDAG.
Okay, so SANDAG would be applying to local assistance over at Caltrans for these funds, or you're going to apply directly to the federal government for these funds?
These ones are interesting. This would be a direct application to U.S. Department of Transportation. State departments of transportation are not an eligible recipient of these funds. It's principally for metropolitan planning organizations like SANDAG, cities, counties, and other entities of the state.
Okay. And so you would, when you got the planning funds appropriated for SANDAG, then you would help member agencies apply for the federal funds themselves to implement projects?
Yeah.
Okay, that's unique. But that is exciting. Did we address the issue of a staff member dedicated to safety? I think early on in the discussion that was one of the thoughts that was put to staff as to whether or not there was going to be an individual dedicated to that. Did that get resolved, or is it still a discussion point?
We found in the agency's review that they all had at least one person dedicated to safety, at least for the ones that we spoke with. As far as going forward, one element of the grant application would include funding for staff support. So that can be a limited term position to be focused on safety. That would be one element of it as this division continues to grow within Sandag.
Okay. Well, it's exciting stuff, and it's important. It's important as well. And I would support the motion I think was made a moment ago as well. So thank you for taking my questions.
Thanks, Mike. Anybody else, comments, questions? If not, I would just add, again, thanks Sam and Erica for the work and the work of the subcommittee on this. For clarity, before we call the vote, I think what we all are suggesting here is that the ITOC very much wants to endorse the work being done in this area and recommend that Transportation Committee and the board, continue to provide their support in making sure work in this important area continues to get done. Actually, I'm now seeing Pedro with a hand raised. Pedro, please.
I truly appreciate the effort that Sam and America did on their work. I also appreciate having the ability to incorporate a safety coordinator staff person via the grant application. But I think that somehow trying to leave it on a grant application, to me, it's a first step, maybe. I don't know how we could go about looking at how to look at, a budget item within the agency that it's not part of a grant and not a limited time position. But I don't know if that's even within our purview.
For clarity, are you actually going so far as to suggest a friendly amendment to the proposal to ask that the board consider staffing a specific position, or are you just really kind of throwing the idea out there?
No, I mean, I would go as far as that, Stuart.
Okay, well, I know I put some words in your mouth. Okay, so we had a motion, a second, and a request for a friendly amendment. Do the motion maker and seconder have willingness to accept the friendly amendment, which is to recommend that the board considers actually staffing this area, whether the grant is the source of funds or not?
Is acceptable to me.
Jonathan, yes. Michael?
No, I just wanted to add that was the point I was trying to make, is I think that that we had discussed a staffing position at Sandag dedicated to this, and it just kind of went away. So it's not a new item, and I would be supportive of it as well.
Got it. Okay, so I'd ask the clerk then to call the roll. We've got a motion and a second that the committee not only wants to formally endorse the work in this area, but in fact recommend that the board consider staffing specifically in the area of safety, someone to be, I guess at one point we'd colloquially refer to it as the safety czar. Whether we want to include that in the motion or not, hopefully you get the idea. But if that's clear and everybody agrees, we can call the roll.
Thank you. For real estate right-of-way acquisition, Jonathan Frankel.
Frankel, yes.
For licensed civil traffic engineer, Michael Kenny.
Approve.
For contractor construction, Pedro Orso Delgado.
Agree.
For biology environmental, Dustin Fuller.
Approve.
For finance and budgeting, Stuart Halpern.
Halpern, approve.
For licensed engineer, Les Hopper.
Approve.
And CEO private sector is absent, and that item does pass unanimously with those members present.
Great, thank you so much. Moving on to item 14, I'll just mention that we have drifted very slightly behind schedule, so we'll try to keep it moving. So item 14 is Specialized Transportation Grant Program Cycle 12, Call for Projects. And Zachary, I believe, is going to be presenting this as an information item.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vice Chair Halpern, and good morning, members of the ITALK. I'm Zach Rivera, and I serve as one of the project managers of the Specialized Transportation Grant Program, or STGP, along with Ali, who you heard earlier. Today, I'll be presenting the proposed eligibility and evaluation criteria used to score applications through the STGP Cycle 12 Call for Projects. And cognizant of time, I'll try to keep this as brief as possible. Next slide. But first, let me provide an overview of the STGP. Established in 2006, the STGP seeks to expand mobility options for older adults and individuals with disabilities whose needs cannot be met by conventional transit or paratransit services. The STGP is composed of the TransNet Senior Mini Grant Program, or SMG, as provided in Section 4C2 of the TransNet Extension Ordinance, as well as the Federal Transit Administration Section 5310 program. Eligible applicants to the STGP include local governmental agencies as well as private nonprofit organizations. Eligible projects include mobility management projects such as travel training or operating projects such as volunteer driver programs. STGP funds are awarded through a competitive process, also referred to as a call for projects. SANDAG generally holds a call for projects every 2 years to allocate available STGP funding. Coming cycle, staff anticipates that a record $7.9 million in STGP funding will be made available. This time 2 years ago, the ITALK reviewed the STGP Cycle 11 eligibility and evaluation criteria. Now, as the 12th cycle progresses, staff proposes modifications to the criteria, which I'll discuss later. Next slide, please. So to prepare for the STGP Cycle 12 call, staff reviewed audit findings, learned, peer research, and input gathered from stakeholders during a robust public engagement process. Staff looked at the fiscal year 2018 FTA triennial review, as well as the fiscal years 2018 and 2021 TransNet triennial performance audits for insights on potential modifications. While no recommendations were made in the FTA review, many of the recommendations in the TransNet triennial performance audits relate to performance management and reporting. For example, one recommendation was for SANDAG to capture additional statistics to better demonstrate how TransNet funds were spent and what taxpayers got for their investment, including the number of, quote, riders through the Senior Mini Grant Program. A summary of recommendations and staff's responses are included in attachment 2 of the staff report. Next slide, please. Staff also researched the evaluation criteria used in other regions. The City of Seattle and East West Gate Council of Governments in St. Louis were selected since their FTA Section 5310 apportionments were comparable to San Diego's. The County of San Diego also recently released a request for proposals for older adult transportation, which helped to inform the proposed Cycle 12 evaluation criteria. And a comparison of the various criteria and their associated weights gathered in this peer review process is included in attachment 1. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, staff began a robust public engagement process in January 2022. Staff presented multiple times to the Council on Access and Mobility, which serves as a forum for specialized transportation providers and other stakeholders in the region. In February 2022, staff held a specialized transportation workshop and released a bilingual specialized transportation survey. Staff also gathered input by engaging the Social Services Transportation Advisory Council, or STAC, as well as the Social Equity Working Group. Through these and other efforts, staff compiled over 120 public comments, affordability for riders, availability and awareness of service, flexibility for providers, and accessibility generally emerged as some of the main themes. Regarding the evaluation criteria specifically, many specialized transportation providers recommended prioritizing the evaluation criterion for effectiveness over the criteria for equity and environmental responsibility. Some stakeholders also suggested that a safety criterion be added. Next slide, please. Much of the input received since the last call for projects was synthesized and incorporated into the 2022 Specialized Transportation Program Management Plan, or PMP, which is an FTA-required guide that describes SANDAG's policies and procedures for administering the STGP. For example, in response to Chair House's comments on alternative services, such as meal deliveries, staff updated the PMP to clarify when those services may be performed and how grantees must track and report on alternative services they provide. Additionally, in response to the TransNet performance audit, the updated PMP includes more robust data collection requirements, including data on the number of unduplicated older adults served through the SMG program. Performance measures and targets for each project type and new safety requirements are also included. Next slide, please. Staff also looked for ways to simplify the application process so that the process itself would not be a barrier to potential applicants. In terms of the minimum and maximum grant award amounts, the existing requirements set caps on the grant award amounts per year, per funding program, per project, and per applicant. Staff proposes to simplify these requirements by eliminating the project minimum and maximum grant request requirements while retaining the maximum applicant grant request per funding program. This ensures that funds are still distributed throughout the region while giving applicants flexibility to request more funding and specialize in a particular project type. Next slide, please. Here are the existing 8 criteria categories used in the cycle 10 and 11 calls for projects. The criteria for project readiness and technical capacity, cost efficiency, and program effectiveness, as well as performance indicators, are given the highest weights, as you can see on the slide. And then the next slide, please. Based on input received in consistency with the 2021 regional plan, staff proposes modifications to the evaluation criteria as shown in attachment 3. Among the draft changes, staff proposes to add a criterion for need and equity to determine the extent to which proposed projects apply a social equity lens to benefit those that need them the most, including historically underserved populations. Staff also proposes to add a criterion for stewardship of public funds and assets in which applicants would be required to demonstrate only necessary and reasonable costs are proposed. Next slide, please. The existing STGP program goal and objectives were also modified to be congruent with the proposed evaluation criteria as shown in attachment 3. The proposed program goal is to improve mobility for older adults and individuals with disabilities by delivering effective, equitable, environmentally responsible, and coordinated transportation solutions that use public funds wisely to address existing gaps in specialized transportation service. Derived from the program goal, the proposed objectives center on 4 themes: effectiveness, equity, environmental responsibility, and coordination. Next slide, please. In terms of next steps, staff plans to present the Cycle 12 eligibility and evaluation criteria to the Transportation Committee on Friday and to the board on June 24th. Pending board approval, the Cycle 12 call is anticipated to be released on July 1st. In August, staff would hold a call for projects webinar to review program requirements and answer prospective applicant questions. Applications would then be due October 1st. Next slide, please. Once the application window closes, there would be, the applications would be reviewed for eligibility, and eligible projects would be scored based on the cycle 12 evaluation criteria this fall. In January of 2023, project rankings would be developed and undergo a QA/QC process before they are presented to the ITALC again in Transportation Committee and Board in February of 2023. Pending board approval, the awarded senior mini grant projects could begin July 1st, and then FTA Section 53 project could begin October 1st, 2023. Next slide, please. So that concludes my presentation. At this time, I'll open it up to you for any questions or suggestions, especially as they relate to the senior mini grant program. While there is no action on this item, any feedback you have will be shared with the Transportation Committee and Board. And thank you.
Thank you, Zachary. I am looking for public comments, and I see Dr. Bilash has his hand raised. Please go ahead.
Hello, I again appreciate you taking my comments. I have no formal connections. I'm just aware that in the Valley Center region, they are focusing on putting up a multi-generational facility, a brand new one, with some look to outreach and providing an area for not only the seniors, but for kind of a gathering place in the wilderness, maybe. And integration of the unincorporated and rural areas for transportation is important and can use some attention. And I, again, have no real connections, but just wanted to mention it under this kind of grant programs, whether that might be an opportunity to enhance the transportation needs in the rural areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bilash. I will now open it up to committee member comments and questions and feedback for Zachary. Yes, Pedro.
Quick question. I've been working recently with UCSD with some of their extension clinics that they have through the community. My question is, would something like USD or UCSD or be eligible to try to apply for some of these projects, or does it have to be a municipality or a transit agency?
Yeah, so we have not had universities apply through the grant program previously. The eligibility requirements are that they're local governmental agencies or private nonprofit organizations. So theoretically, if those entities want to apply, they could.
Thank you. I will mention it to them.
Perfect.
Anyone else? If not, thank you again, Zachary, and let's move on to item 15 is an information item. I think Michelle Smith is here. Is the TransNet Major Corridor Regional Bikeway Program Project Quarterly Status Report.
Actually filling in for Michelle Smith today, so I'll be giving you a brief overview of the report. So just briefly, so this report provides the ITALC with a quarterly update on the status of major transit, highway, and bikeway projects within the TransNet Major Corridors and Regional Bikeway programs. So some of the recent accomplishments and progress that occurred between January and March of 2022 include the opening of 9 new miles of carpool and HOV lanes along the I-5. In February, we also opened the 4th and 5th Avenue bikeways to users and celebrated with a community bike ride led by the San Diego County Bike Coalition and Circulate San Diego. As shown in attachment 1 of the report, in the first quarter, we also have overall 5 major project milestones that were completed, with 3 additional milestones that were completed between April and May. This report also utilizes the Engineering News Record, which is a trade publication providing industry-wide engineering and construction analysis. So over this last quarter, That report saw a construction cost index increase of about 2.5%. So these are just some of the highlights of our projects and kind of progress within the San Diego region. But I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Great, thank you, Chelsea. I am not seeing any hands for public comments, so I'll open it up to my colleagues, excuse me, on the committee for any comments or questions. Anyone? Looking like we do not have any, Chelsea. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're now up to item 16, which is looking at our future meeting schedule. The next regular ITALK meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, July 13th, 2022 at 9:30. And unless I have any other comments from my colleagues, I think we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Okay.
Thank you, Stuart.
Bye.